The road to Black Hollow was slick with rain, the skies a dark mass of storm clouds rolling in as if the heavens themselves had been stirred by something vile. My tires crunched over broken glass, and debris scattered along the asphalt as I drove into town. I'd received a message from Sheriff Avery the night before, a hurried, static-filled plea for help, his voice frayed with panic and fear. By the time I hit the main strip, I could already tell I was too late. The first sign was the silence. A town like this, even at night, should have had something. A stray dog, crickets chirping, a breeze rattling the leaves. But here, there was nothing. Just a stillness that wrapped around me, thick and suffocating. My headlights swept over abandoned cars, some with doors open and belongings strewn on the street as if the people inside had fled in a hurry. There was blood on the ground, dark stains that trailed away into the shadows, leading to nothing but empty air. I parked near the diner where Sheriff Avery had last mentioned and stepped out, the weight of my weapons heavy on my belt. The air was thick with the stench of death, coppery and foul, mixed with something musky and wild that made my skin crawl. Whatever had hit this town, it hadn't left survivors. As I moved deeper into Black Hollow, the damage became more apparent. Storefronts were shattered, claw marks raked across walls, and blood splashed high on the windows as if something had thrown bodies against them with reckless abandon. I paused in front of the diner, peering through the broken glass at the wreckage inside. The scene was carnage. Tables overturned, chairs splintered, and the remains of meals scattered across the floor, mixed with blood and bits of flesh. Claw marks scored the walls, each one deep and jagged, as if whatever had done this had taken its time, savoring the destruction. My stomach twisted as I saw bodies, mangled, shredded, barely recognizable as human. Limbs twisted at odd angles, faces frozen in silent screams, and pools of blood thick and dark under the flickering fluorescent lights. A growl rumbled in the distance, low and guttural, carrying through the silence like a warning. I froze, hand hovering over my silver-tipped knife as I scanned the street. The growl grew louder, followed by the soft sound of claws scratching against concrete, and then I saw it, a figure slinking out from the shadows, eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It was hunched, its body covered in matted fur, with a snout that dripped with saliva and blood. A werewolf? It looked at me, head cocked, nostrils flaring as it caught my scent. For a moment, we stood there, eyes locked, sizing each other up. Then, from the darkness behind it, more shapes appeared, emerging one by one. They moved with a strange, animalistic fluidity, jaws snapping, claws flexing. I counted 5, then 7, then 10, an entire pack, all eyes fixed on me. I took a slow, steady breath, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a hunting pack. There was no coordination, no order. These creatures were unhinged, driven by nothing but bloodlust and fury. They were here for one reason only, to kill. One of them snarled, lips peeling back to reveal rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth, and that was all the warning I got before it lunged. I dropped low, drawing my knife as it sailed over me, claws grazing the top of my shoulder. I spun, driving the silver blade into its side. The beast let out a screech that echoed down the empty street, its flesh sizzling where the silver touched. I twisted the knife, feeling it tear through muscle, then yanked it free as the werewolf stumbled back, clutching its side. The others circled me, growls deepening, their eyes burning with a savage rage. I pulled my handgun, loaded with silver rounds, and fired into the nearest one. The bullet tore through its chest, and it collapsed in a heap, twitching and snarling as blood pooled beneath it. But the rest of them didn't retreat. If anything, the scent of blood only drove them into a frenzy. They charged all at once, a wave of claws and teeth. I ducked and rolled, firing off rounds as I moved, each shot echoing through the silent town. The air filled with the stench of burnt fur and blood as I dropped one, then another, but they kept coming, relentless and unyielding. One of them barreled into me, knocking the gun from my hand, its claws raking across my chest as I fought to keep its jaws away from my throat. I drove my knee into its ribs, hearing a satisfying crack, and shoved it back just enough to reach for my knife. Before it could react, I plunged the blade into its throat, twisting hard. Blood sprayed, hot and thick, covering my hands and face as the werewolf let out a choked snarl, collapsing at my feet. I barely had time to catch my breath before the next one was on me, teeth sinking into my arm with a force that nearly shattered bone. I gritted my teeth against the pain, managing to grab a broken glass shard from the ground and stab it into the creature's eye. It howled, releasing me as it staggered back, clawing at its face. I didn't waste a second lunging forward to finish it off with the knife. Another werewolf slammed into my side, sending me sprawling into the wall of a nearby building. I felt something crack, pain lancing through my ribs, but I forced myself to stand. The pack was thinning, but there were still too many, and I was already bleeding, every movement slow and heavy. I scanned the street, calculating my options, but there were none. This was it. I'd walked into the den of a nightmare, and there was no way out. One of the remaining werewolves lunged at me, claws raised, and I ducked, swinging the knife in a wide arc. It caught the creature across the chest, opening a deep gash that splattered blood across the pavement. The beast staggered back, snarling, but I didn't give it a chance to recover. I followed through with a brutal punch to its jaw, then drove my knee into its stomach, forcing it to the ground. I raised the knife, bringing it down into its skull with a force that made my arm ache. The street was slick with blood, bodies piling around me as the last of the werewolves circled, wary but still hungry. I stood there panting, blood dripping from my wounds, every muscle screaming with exhaustion. The silence settled over the town once more, broken only by the low growls of the remaining werewolves. I wasn't done yet. The silence that followed my skirmish with the werewolves was heavy, a brief lull in a storm I knew wasn't over. Blood soaked my clothes and hands, mixing with the grime on the pavement. My ribs throbbed from the hit I'd taken, and my arms were streaked with red, where teeth and claws had torn through my jacket. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and retrieved my handgun from where it had skidded across the ground during the brawl. The weight of it was a comfort, though I knew I was running low on ammo. The creatures I'd already killed lay scattered across the street, twisted forms still smoking from the silver rounds. But I knew they weren't alone. Somewhere in the shadows, others were watching, waiting for the scent of blood to draw them out. I moved cautiously, my eyes sweeping over the darkened buildings and alleys. Every creak of wood and rustle of debris put me on edge, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting a snarling face to emerge from the dark. The town wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, as if every corner held the memory of the massacre that had taken place. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, people who'd tried to flee or hide, only to be hunted down. I ducked into a nearby hardware store, its windows shattered and shelves overturned. Shards of glass crunched under my boots as I moved inside, searching for anything that might help. The store was a mess, but I spotted a few items I could use. I grabbed a roll of duct tape, some rope, and a couple of metal tools, a crowbar and a wrench. Makeshift weapons, perhaps, but they'd be better than nothing if I ran out of silver. The dim interior gave me a moment to catch my breath, but the quiet was short-lived. A low growl drifted in from outside, echoing down the street, followed by a series of snarls and scratching sounds. They were close. I peered out through a broken window and saw them. More of the beasts, emerging from the shadows like wraiths. They moved without a hint of coordination, a pack in body but not in mind. Their eyes gleamed with a savage hunger, focused on one thing: me. I took a deep breath, gripping the crowbar tightly in one hand and my gun in the other. I couldn't wait them out. They'd tear this place apart to get to me. My only choice was to go on the offensive, to make every shot count. I positioned myself by the door, pressing my back to the wall as I steadied my breath. The first beast approached, claws raking across the pavement as it sniffed the air. I burst out of the doorway, firing a shot straight into its chest. The silver round exploded on impact, the creature's howl piercing the silence as it staggered back, its fur singed and smoking. Before it could recover, I swung the crowbar into its jaw, the crunch of bone and flesh satisfying in the midst of the carnage. The werewolf collapsed and I turned, bracing myself for the others. They charged, a mass of fur and fangs. I fired off another round, dropping one, but a second lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. Its claws tore at my shoulder, hot pain flaring through my body. I managed to jam the crowbar into its side, using it as leverage to shove the creature off me. It stumbled, and I scrambled to my feet, driving the crowbar down onto its skull with all the strength I had left. Blood sprayed, hot and sticky, covering my hands and face. Another one was on me in seconds, snapping its jaws inches from my throat. I twisted, slamming the butt of my gun against its snout, then fired into its chest as it recoiled. The silver round did its job, and the creature slumped, twitching in its death throes. I was panting now, each breath ragged as I staggered back, surveying the bodies around me. But the sound of snarling told me it wasn't over. From the corner of my eye, I saw another werewolf emerging from an alley, followed by two more, their movements frantic, their eyes wild. They weren't stopping, and I was quickly running out of ammo. Retreat wasn't an option. If I backed down, they'd just tear through me like they had the rest of the town. I had to keep fighting, keep them on their toes. I ducked back into the hardware store, grabbing a glass bottle from a nearby shelf, then stuffed a rag into its neck. A quick spark from a lighter I found on the counter, and I had a makeshift Molotov cocktail. It was risky, but I was past caring. I stepped back into the doorway, holding the bottle aloft as the beasts charged. With a yell, I hurled the Molotov at the nearest one. The bottle shattered on impact, flames bursting across its fur. The werewolf screamed, a guttural, furious sound, as the fire spread, licking at its body, consuming it in an instant. It thrashed, slamming into another beast, spreading the flames. The others hesitated, a moment of uncertainty flickering in their eyes as the scent of burning flesh filled the air. I used the distraction, raising my gun and firing another round, taking down one of the hesitating werewolves. Blood sprayed from the wound, and the creature staggered, collapsing in a heap. But the pause was brief. The remaining ones snapped out of it, their rage renewed as they charged me again. One of them leaped, claws outstretched, and I ducked. feeling the rush of air as it sailed over me, landing heavily on the ground. I swung the crowbar down onto its back, feeling the bones crack beneath the force. It howled, snapping its jaws as it writhed beneath me, but I pressed down, putting all my weight behind the blow. The others closed in, and I swung wildly, feeling the strain in my muscles, the exhaustion creeping in. My vision was starting to blur, the pain in my body merging with the fatigue that weighed on me like a lead weight. I couldn't keep this up. There were too many of them, and I was nearly spent. Just as I felt myself reaching my breaking point, the last of my rounds clicked empty. I cursed under my breath, bracing myself as the werewolves surrounded me, their snarls low and threatening. My body was shaking, blood dripped from cuts and gashes, but I held the crowbar tightly, ready to go down fighting. The beasts circled, their eyes fixed on me, fangs bared in anticipation. I could feel the despair creeping in, the realization that I might not make it out of this. But I shoved it down, tightening my grip on the crowbar, refusing to give in. With a final roar, the werewolves lunged. I swung, connecting with bone and flesh, feeling the resistance as I fought them off with everything I had. The world narrowed, became a blur of snarls and blood and pain as I gave everything, every last ounce of strength, to keep them at bay. And then, silence. I stood there, panting, covered in blood, mine and theirs, the crowbar slipping from my grasp as I sank to my knees, my vision swimming. The street was littered with bodies, the ground slick with blood, but I was alive, for now. The streets of Black Hollow were stained red, a sickening, sticky path of blood, marking my every step as I moved from one battleground to the next. I'd lost track of how many of them I'd taken down, how many times I'd stared death in the face. My body was battered, every muscle aching, but there was no room for weakness, not with more of those things prowling around, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. My gun was nearly empty, the last few silver bullets held tight in my pocket like a lifeline. I'd already used up most of my makeshift weapons, the Molotov, the broken glass, the crowbar. Each tool was a temporary savior, buying me a few precious seconds before the next wave hit. And they kept coming, relentless and mindless, like some unseen force was driving them forward, pushing them to tear me apart, piece by piece. I moved carefully, sticking close to the walls, keeping to the edges of the buildings. The once quiet town had become a wasteland, a battlefield painted in gore and chaos. I passed the gas station, its pumps twisted and charred from the explosion that had taken out a handful of werewolves earlier. The smell of gasoline and burned fur lingered in the air, a thick, nauseating scent that clung to my skin. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, barely catching a glimpse of a werewolf slinking between buildings. It was watching me, its yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, but it didn't attack. Not yet. It seemed to be assessing me, waiting for the right moment. Smart. Smarter than I'd given them credit for. Keeping my breathing steady, I edged toward a nearby alleyway, intending to use it as a choke point if they came for me again. The walls were narrow, the path tight, perfect for trapping them in single file, where I could pick them off one by one. I crouched, every sense on high alert, waiting for them to make the first move. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of debris and the distant eerie howls that echoed through the empty streets. I could feel them surrounding me, closing in from all sides. They were waiting, patient, hungry. Suddenly, one of them lunged from the shadows, claws reaching for my throat. I rolled to the side, firing a shot that caught it in the shoulder. It staggered, snarling, and I took the opportunity to swing my knife, slicing across its chest in a spray of blood. The beast stumbled back, clutching its wound, but another one appeared behind it, jaws snapping as it charged forward. I fired again, the bullet striking its head, and it crumpled to the ground. But they kept coming. More werewolves emerged from the darkness, driven by an insatiable hunger that seemed to multiply with each death. The alleyway became a killing ground, my last stand against a horde that seemed endless. I switched tactics, grabbing a metal rod from the ground and swinging it like a bat, using the narrow space to my advantage. Each hit connected with a sickening crunch, but every blow cost me. My arms burned, my vision blurred, and I could feel the energy draining from my body with every second that passed. Blood splattered the walls, the ground, my hands, thick and dark, coating everything in a sticky film that made it hard to keep my grip. But I kept swinging, kept fighting, refusing to let them close the gap. If I stopped, even for a moment, I knew they'd tear me apart. One of them caught my arm, its claws digging deep, ripping through skin and muscle. I cried out, pain exploding up my arm, but I used the momentum to drive my knife into its side. The creature howled, blood pouring from the wound, but it only seemed to fuel its frenzy. It snapped at me, jaws inches from my face, and I had to twist away, feeling its hot breath on my skin. I staggered back, pressing myself against the alley wall, my chest heaving, my body screaming for rest. The werewolves paused, circling, their eyes fixed on me with a cold, calculating hunger. They were testing me, waiting for me to break. And then, something shifted. A low growl echoed from the end of the alley, deeper and more guttural than any I'd heard. I turned, seeing the massive silhouette of another werewolf, a larger, more powerful one, its fur darker, its body rippling with muscle. It wasn't an alpha, but it was different, stronger, more dangerous. The others fell back, deferring to it as it stepped forward, its eyes locked onto mine. I tightened my grip on my knife, knowing this would be my hardest fight yet. This one wasn't like the rest. It was smarter, more aware, and it could sense my weakness. The werewolf lunged, faster than I could react. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through fabric and flesh, and I barely managed to twist away, slashing at its side with the knife. The blade cut deep, but it barely slowed, turning on me with a snarl, jaws snapping. I ducked, swinging the metal rod, but it caught the blow, ripping the weapon from my hands with a strength that left me reeling. Desperation kicked in. I reached for my last few bullets, fumbling as I loaded them into the gun. The werewolf watched, its eyes gleaming with cruel intelligence, as if it knew exactly what I was doing. It crouched, preparing to strike, muscles coiled like a spring. The moment stretched, tension crackling in the air as we stared each other down. Then it pounced, jaws wide, claws extended, and I fired. The bullet struck it in the chest, and it let out a roar of pain, staggering back. I fired again, hitting its shoulder, and the beast dropped to one knee, blood streaming from its wounds. It growled, a guttural, furious sound, but I didn't stop. I emptied the last round into its skull, watching as it finally collapsed, its body going still. The alley fell silent. I stood there, panting, blood dripping from my wounds. every inch of me aching. My vision swam, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. The fight had taken everything I had, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. But I couldn't stop either. I forced myself to move, staggering out of the alley and back onto the main street. The town was eerily quiet again, but I knew there were more out there. I could feel them, lurking just beyond the edge of the shadows, watching me. I stumbled toward the sheriff's station, hoping for a brief moment of shelter, a chance to regroup. The door was unlocked, and I slipped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The place was a wreck, furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and blood smeared along the walls. It looked like a last stand, the sheriff and his deputies fighting to the bitter end. I made my way to the back office, where a map was pinned to the wall, marked with red circles and notes. It showed the town and its outskirts, with certain areas labeled with warnings: danger, unknown sightings, avoid at all costs. I realized this wasn't a random outbreak. The town had been fighting something for years, but they'd kept it quiet, hoping it wouldn't escalate. I scanned the map, my eyes catching on a section labeled Hunting Grounds, just beyond the edge of town. That's where it had started. Recent construction had pushed into those lands, disturbing something dormant, something that had been waiting. The quiet didn't last. From somewhere in the building, I heard a low, menacing growl. I turned, gun raised, but my ammo was gone, and I knew I didn't have much fight left in me. The werewolves had found me, drawn by the scent of blood. I braced myself as the growls grew louder, the shadows shifting as they closed in. The sheriff's station was supposed to be a place of law, a sanctuary for those seeking protection. But as I stood in the dimly lit hallway, blood dripping from my arms, my legs trembling with exhaustion, it felt like anything but. The walls around me were smeared with blood, claw marks carved deep into the plaster, and the stench of death and decay hung thick in the air. This wasn't a shelter. It was a tomb, left to rot along with the town it had failed to protect. From deeper within the building came a low, guttural growl, echoing off the walls. My grip tightened around the only weapon I had left, a rusted fire axe I'd pulled from an emergency cabinet. My gun was empty, my knife dulled from use, and my body felt like it could give out at any second. I knew that whatever was coming would be my last stand if I wasn't careful. I moved carefully, my boots slipping on patches of blood as I navigated the dark hallways. Every corner felt like a trap, every shadow a potential enemy. The growls grew louder, shifting from one end of the building to another, a reminder that I wasn't alone. And then I heard it, the faint sound of claws scraping against metal, coming from the direction of the holding cells. They were trapped back there, caught by the sheriff's last attempt to contain the chaos. It seemed they hadn't escaped yet, but judging by the sounds of their claws tearing at the metal, they were working on it. The idea of those beasts locked up, with nothing but a few iron bars between them and freedom, sent a chill down my spine. They were stronger than any prison cell could hold for long. I stepped closer, moving down a corridor that reeked of rust and blood, and came to a corner where the hallway branched off toward the cells. The shadows shifted, and I could make out the faint outlines of the creatures, hulking figures that moved restlessly behind the bars, their glowing eyes tracking me the moment I came into view. The first of them snarled, pressing its clawed hands against the bars, flexing its grip as if testing the metal. Its face was twisted in rage, saliva dripping from its jaws as it let out a low, menacing growl. I could see the muscles under its fur ripple as it shifted, sizing me up. There were 4 of them in total, each one a twisted mass of muscle and fury, their claws long and sharp, ready to tear through flesh the moment they broke free. "Just stay there, you sons of bitches," I muttered, gripping the axe tighter. One of them lunged, slamming into the bars with enough force to make the metal creak. I took a step back, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The cell doors weren't going to hold much longer. The werewolves knew it too. I watched as they clawed and tore at the bars, gnashing their teeth in frustration, their bodies pressed against the doors with animalistic fury. And then, with a horrifying screech of metal, the lock on the nearest cell snapped. The first werewolf burst free, its body crashing forward in a frenzy, and I swung the axe with everything I had, the blade slicing into its shoulder. Blood sprayed, and the creature let out a furious howl, snapping at me as it staggered back. I didn't give it a chance to recover, wrenching the axe free and swinging again, aiming for its neck. The blade connected, slicing deep, but the werewolf kept coming, its claws slashing at my arm as it lunged forward. Pain exploded through my arm, but I ignored it, gritting my teeth as I drove the axe into its skull. The creature went rigid, its body convulsing as it let out a final blood-curdling growl before collapsing to the ground. I staggered back, gasping for breath, blood dripping down my arm from the gash it had left behind. But there was no time to rest. The second werewolf was already out, its eyes locked on me with a look of pure, unfiltered rage. I barely had time to brace myself before it was on me, its claws slashing through the air as it charged. I swung the axe up just in time, blocking its claws, but the force of the blow sent me stumbling back, my feet slipping on the blood-slick floor. The beast lunged, jaws snapping inches from my face, and I twisted, bringing the axe down onto its back. It yelped, writhing in pain, but its fury only seemed to grow. It spun, raking its claws across my chest, tearing through fabric and skin alike. The pain was sharp, searing, but I couldn't stop. I swung the axe again, burying it into the werewolf's side, feeling the crunch of bone as it hit. The creature staggered, its body shaking as blood poured from its wounds. I took the chance, wrenching the axe free and swinging one last time, the blade slicing clean through its neck. The werewolf's head hit the ground with a sickening thud, its body collapsing in a heap beside it. I was gasping now, each breath ragged and shallow, but I couldn't stop. The third werewolf had broken free, and it wasted no time, leaping toward me with a snarl that echoed off the walls. I dodged, barely avoiding its claws, and brought the axe down onto its leg, hoping to slow it down. The creature howled in pain, stumbling as it tried to stand, but it was relentless, lunging at me with renewed fury. I swung again, the blade slicing across its chest, but it didn't even flinch. Its claws tore into my side, and I felt hot blood pour down my ribs, soaking my shirt as the pain shot through me. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to overtake me, and drove the axe into its throat, twisting the blade as I pulled back. The werewolf's snarl turned into a gurgle as blood filled its throat, and it stumbled, collapsing to the ground in a twitching, bloody heap. I stood over it, panting, every muscle in my body screaming in agony. The floor was slick with blood, my clothes soaked, but there was still one more to go. The fourth werewolf was larger than the others, its eyes filled with a cold, calculating intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't charge like the others. Instead, it circled me, its gaze never leaving mine, as if it was studying me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tightened my grip on the axe, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over me like a lead blanket. My body was battered, my vision swimming, but I couldn't back down. This was the last one. If I could take it down, maybe, just maybe, I'd survive this nightmare. The werewolf lunged, moving faster than I'd expected, and I barely had time to bring the axe up before it was on me. Its claws raked across my arm, tearing through flesh, and I cried out, stumbling back. The creature didn't relent, pressing forward, its jaws snapping at my throat. I twisted, driving the axe into its side, but it barely slowed, its eyes blazing with fury as it pushed forward, its strength overwhelming. I felt my back hit the wall, the werewolf's claws pinning me in place, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then a surge of adrenaline kicked in, and I gritted my teeth, reaching for the knife at my belt. With a desperate cry, I drove the blade into its neck, twisting it as the creature howled in pain. The werewolf stumbled back, its body convulsing. I didn't give it a chance to recover. I swung the axe with every ounce of strength I had left, the blade sinking deep into its chest. The creature let out one final, anguished roar before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching as the life drained from it. I staggered back, my body trembling, every inch of me covered in blood. The hallway was silent again, the only sounds my ragged breaths and the steady drip of blood pooling around me. I'd done it. I'd taken them all down, but as I leaned against the wall, struggling to catch my breath, I heard a faint, distant howl echoing through the empty streets. There were more out there. The battle wasn't over yet. The first light of dawn crept over Black Hollow, casting long, pale shadows across the smoldering remains of the town. Blood painted the streets, darkening in patches where I'd fought through waves of werewolves, their bodies piled like twisted, nightmarish monuments to the massacre I'd barely survived. My limbs felt like lead, every cut and bruise throbbing in time with my heartbeat, as I stumbled through the main square, searching for something, anything that might offer shelter or salvation. My axe was slick with blood, the blade chipped and dull from hacking through bone and flesh. My last few rounds were gone, spent hours ago when the onslaught had seemed endless, and now every sound, every shifting shadow felt like a threat. I had reached my limit. Even standing felt like an act of defiance. But I wasn't going to let this place take me without a fight. As I limped forward, a faint hum filled the air, growing louder and sharper until it cut through the silence like a blade. I stopped, squinting into the rising sun, and caught sight of a dark shape silhouetted against the pale sky. The sound of helicopter blades whipped through the morning calm, and as the aircraft descended, I felt a surge of relief so intense it was nearly dizzying. The helicopter, a Black Hawk painted in matte black, landed in the middle of the street, sending debris scattering. I shielded my face from the wind as the chopper doors slid open and figures in dark tactical gear disembarked, moving with military precision as they fanned out, weapons raised. They were covered head to toe, their faces masked, with insignias that marked them as part of a specialized covert unit. They didn't look surprised by what they saw in Black Hollow. If anything, their movements suggested they'd come expecting this level of carnage. The lead operative, a tall man with an authoritative bearing, raised his hand, signaling the others to move in and secure the area. He strode toward me, his rifle lowered but ready, his face obscured by the shadow of his helmet. "Lucas Moore," he called, his voice muffled by his mask, but carrying an air of calm authority. I nodded, barely able to keep myself upright. "You're a bit late," I managed, my voice hoarse and cracked. The man tilted his head, studying me for a moment before speaking. "We were alerted when you failed to check in with your contact," he said, his tone even. "The name's Commander Hale. We're here to assist with containment." I glanced around at the ruins of the town, the bodies strewn across the streets, and let out a bitter laugh. "There's not much left to contain." Hale's gaze swept over the carnage, his face unreadable behind the mask. "Still, we'll take it from here," he said, then gestured to the rest of his team. "Secure the area. We need to make sure nothing's left breathing." The operatives moved with silent efficiency, spreading out in a tight formation as they began sweeping the streets. Their rifles were outfitted with silver-tipped rounds, I noticed, and they moved with a practiced, almost mechanical precision that suggested they were no strangers to this kind of horror. Hale turned back to me. "Looks like you've had a rough night." "You could say that," I replied, leaning heavily against a nearby lamppost. Every bone in my body ached, and the adrenaline that had kept me moving was draining fast, leaving me cold and numb. He handed me a water canteen, and I took it gratefully, the cool liquid easing the dryness in my throat. "How many were there?" he asked, watching me with an appraising look. "Lost count," I said, my voice low. It felt like the whole damn town was infected. He nodded, as if he'd expected as much. "We've been tracking outbreaks like this," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The town's expansion disturbed something. The government had eyes on Black Hollow for months. They'd seen the signs, a rise in aggression, strange sightings at night, a few unexplained deaths. I felt a surge of anger, raw and hot. And no one thought to step in? People were massacred here, Hale. I was called in because the sheriff was desperate. We're not here to save towns more. We're here to contain threats," Hale replied, his voice cool and unyielding. "Our job is to make sure this doesn't spread. The fact that you were able to neutralize most of the infected on your own saved us a lot of trouble." I clenched my jaw, feeling a flicker of resentment, but knowing it wouldn't do any good. This wasn't the first time I'd been the only one willing to get my hands dirty, and it wouldn't be the last. I looked out over the destruction, feeling the weight of the dead pressing down on me, their faces flashing through my mind. This town was a scar that would stay with me long after I left. Hale must have sensed my thoughts, because he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black card, pressing it into my hand. "If you're looking for something bigger than small town contracts, give this a call," he said, his voice softened slightly. "You handled yourself well here. There aren't many people who can take on something like this and walk away." I glanced down at the card. It was blank, except for a number printed in stark white. No name, no address, just a direct line to whatever organization Hale worked for. I pocketed it, nodding. "I'll think about it." Before he could respond, a burst of gunfire echoed through the streets, sharp and staccato. I looked up to see his operatives engaging the last remnants of the werewolves that had somehow survived the night. One of the creatures broke through an alley, charging at the team with a snarl that made my blood run cold, but they were ready. 3 rounds struck it in quick succession, each one landing with deadly precision, and the beast crumpled to the ground. Hale's gaze didn't waver. "That's our job, Moore," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "We clean up what's left." The gunfire died down, replaced by the low hum of the helicopter's engines as it idled, ready for extraction. Hale turned to me again, giving a small nod. "You'll need medical attention," he said, gesturing for one of his operatives to help me into the helicopter. Get some rest. This is just the beginning. I climbed into the chopper, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally settle over me as I sank into the seat. One of the medics checked my wounds, binding them as best they could, but my mind was elsewhere, drifting through the memories of the night, the blood, the screams, the hollow eyes of the townsfolk who hadn't survived. This place had been a graveyard long before I arrived. The helicopter lifted off, and as we ascended, I looked down at Black Hollow, watching as the town grew smaller, the devastation blurring with distance. I could still see the plumes of smoke rising from where I'd set traps, the dark stains marking the places where I'd fought tooth and nail. Hale's team moved through the town with ruthless efficiency, putting down anything that stirred, ensuring there was no chance of survival for the curse that had consumed this place. As the landscape stretched out below us, I felt the weight of the night settle in my bones. I'd survived, but the toll was more than physical. Each town I left felt like another piece of myself left behind, another name etched into the growing list of places I'd failed to save. I looked at the black card in my hand, turning it over, the number glinting in the light of the dawn. This wasn't over, and I knew it. Hale's words echoed in my mind. This is just the beginning. For now, I leaned back, letting the hum of the helicopter lull me into a heavy, dreamless sleep, knowing that as long as monsters roamed the earth, there would be no true rest.